by the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, on most major cities and towns in the UK. The word Blitz comes from the German term Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. The Blitz began on 7th of September 1940. It was called Black Saturday. The Germans dropped around 300 tons of bombs on London, targeting important places, mainly ports. This raid left 430 dead and 1,600 injured. After Black Saturday, the Germans bombed Britain for 57 consecutive nights. Because London was the capital, it was bombed more severely and more heavily than other places, but almost all major cities were bombed. In rather small cities, the impact of a large air raid could be huge. Most air raids were at night, though some were in the day too. The Blitz finally ended in June 1940, when attacks were directed towards Russia and places in the Mediterranean. The Blitz had left more than 43,500 people dead.
My great-gramps in the war. My great-gramps and his father had a huge explosion. They lived in Harwich, 2 streets away from the sea, and his father took him to the seafront, which by then was all covered by barbed wire, and they saw HMS Gypsy, a naval destroyer, which had been blown up by a magnetic mine from under the sea. They saw and heard sailors shouting in the water. History tells us 31 of the crew were killed, but thankfully 115 were saved. By June 1940, all the schools were closed and children with gas masks, labels and ration books, etc. were evacuated to both Thornbury and Dursley villages in Gloucestershire. He went to his auntie's to Whittle, a little village near Chelmsford. In late 1940, he remembers watching numerous aircraft of all sorts in the clear blue sky, including the famous Spitfires having a dogfight. It was part of the famous Battle of Britain taking place before his very eyes. When my gramps and his father were driving through London, he said, "Look, the Houses of Parliament are alight. They have been lit by incendiary bombs." Also, the bus bombs of Doodlebugs in 1944, he saw some coming down to earth and explode. Being evacuated. In 1940, the government decided that Harwich, where they lived, wasn't a safe place for children in case the Germans invaded there. Her sister was 7. She was 5, but her 2-year-old sister stayed with their mum. They went from Harwich to Thornbury with their school, called Esplanade Infant School. They left the train station at about 8 a.m. and arrived at about 5:30 p.m. with 65 children and 5 adults. My great-grandma gave me the sheet of the evacuation times, schools, what they needed, etc. When they arrived, they sat on the floor of the church, and people in the village would come in and choose the people they wanted to live with them. Luckily, they were chosen by a couple who loved children, but didn't have any of their own. If there were air raids when they were walking home, they would knock on somebody's door and stay with them until the raid was over. They got taught how to use a gas mask at school. In 1942, her father came to see her. It was decided then that it was safe to go back to Harwich. But when my great-grandma's dad knocked at the door, she said, "Who is this soldier?" She stayed in touch with her foster parents after the war. They went and saw them again. They continued to stay in touch with Auntie Edna and took their children, my grandma and great-uncle, to see them.
This is what my grandfather told me about the Blitz when I spoke to him. What was it like in the shelters? They're very small, but you could get 3 or 4 people inside. It was known as an Anderson shelter, but there are others. I think they're called Morrison shelters. But we had an Anderson shelter in the back garden, and it wasn't taken away for years after the war ended. Sometimes, if you didn't have time to get down to the shelter, you used to have to go in the cupboard under the stairs. And I can remember I had to eat Sunday lunch in there one day with my mother and my auntie. My father was on the move, and so he was away at sea, but it was very cramped and dark and pretty frightening. What sort of food did you have? It was a lot of rationing, and you couldn't get a sausage or 2 sausages a week. And you had maybe 1 egg, and it was very hard times. You could get potatoes, turnips, parsnips and things like that. You couldn't get the sort of foods you have nowadays. Why were the Germans bombing shelters? The Germans wanted to conquer England, and so they tried to bomb the big cities, including where we lived, and tried to kill as many people as they could, so the Germans could take over our country. We didn't want that, and when they were overheard, we had to go into shelters. If you're in the middle of London at the time, you had to go down into the underground stations to keep out of the way.
Britain has ever seen came later than expected. For days, Germany's imminent collapse had been reported in broadcasts and newspapers, and at 2:41 a.m. on Monday, 7th of May, General Alfred Jodl, representing the German High Command, signed the instrument of unconditional surrender at General Eisenhower's HQ at Reims. Fighting had stopped. The war was over. In April 1945, the War Cabinet drew up plans for a National Day of Thanksgiving in honour of victory in Europe. A committee was appointed to oversee such details as a relaxation of the blackout and floodlighting of public buildings, ringing of church bells, and local victory parades. The nation was on tenterhooks, an air of anticipation about. Finally, on the 7th of May, the BBC interrupted that evening's programme to announce that the next day, a Tuesday, would be VE Day, and that the Prime Minister would address the nation, and that, for most people, it would be a holiday. Some threw off their wartime shackles immediately, rushing down the pub, or digging out the bottles of beer and spirits they'd been saving. One Londoner admitted that his plans went no further than getting really blind drunk. There was a sense of both release and disbelief.
VE Day, May 1945. In May 1945, the Germans signed the papers that said they had surrendered and that the war was over. We call this VE Day. VE stands for Victory in Europe, and to celebrate this, at the time, thousands of people crowded in the streets of towns and cities singing and cheering. VJ Day, August 1945. After VE Day, the war still wasn't over, since the Americans were still fighting Japan. But after just a couple of months, in August 1945, they also surrendered. We call this VJ Day, for victory over Japan. And again, at the time, people gathered in the streets and celebrated, whilst the royal family and Churchill celebrated from their balcony in Buckingham Palace.
The Day the War Ended by Randall Springler.
The day the war ended. On the day the war ended, the sun laced the avenues with lime tree scent. The silver birches danced on the sidewalk, and the girls came out like tulips in their colours.
Only the soldiers were caught like sleepwalkers wakened unaware, naked there in the street. Fatuous in flowers were tanks like tamed elephants, wallowed among the crowds in the square.
There is a moment when contradictions cross, a split of a moment when history twirls on one toe, like a ballerina, and all men are really equal, and happiness could be impartial for once.
Only the soldier snatched by the sunny star, and his world's turning whirled like a meteor, through a phoenix night of stars has fallen.
And his trajectory bows, and earth begins to pull again. His whole is moving with the sound of sorrow and the loss.